At the height of its popularity, Game of Thrones was a worldwide phenomenon and among HBO's most successful shows, with a large and highly dedicated fan base. But during the airing of the series' final episodes, public opinion changed dramatically, with fans and critics alike deriding the show for what they saw as a fall from the high quality that it once was. So what happened to evoke such a negative response for something once so highly regarded? I believe that the audience's turn against the series comes down to a fundamental shift in priorities during the latter half of the series, where many of the hallmarks of quality television, as well as the typical imperatives of a premium cable channel such as HBO, were abandoned in favor of practices more in line with traditional broadcast television models of trying to appeal to as large an audience as possible, at the cost of much of the complexity and realism that gave Game of Thrones its loyal following from the beginning. As a pay cable channel, HBO has long branded itself as something that produces quality and exclusive content that is distinguished above the over-commercialized standard of regular broadcast television made for the masses. This quality over quantity approach led to the development of highly acclaimed original programming on HBO, such as Sex and the City, The Sopranos, and The Wire. The freedom provided by HBO's subscription-based economic model meant that these series could feature more explicit subject matter within serialized, immersive narratives around complex characters without fear of the content restrictions imposed by advertisers. Boundaries were not only able to be, but were encouraged to be pushed on HBO in order to distinguish these series from the familiar offerings of network television. The goal was not to attract the largest audience numbers, but rather smaller, niche audiences that liked the shows so much they were willing to pay extra money to consume this exclusive and quality content. Game of Thrones certainly fit this model of HBO quality programming in the show's earlier seasons, where the focus of the series was on a diverse cast of morally gray characters with complex personal and political relationships interwoven in a rich story world with realistic consequences. As has been said about The Wire, complex narratives in television are often likened to a visual novel, so one would assume that directly adapting George R.R. Martin's dense series of novels would perfectly fit HBO's goals of quality programming. The problem for Game of Thrones arises when about halfway through the production of the series, the plot of the show eclipsed the plot of the still incomplete books. Once the show ran out of source material to adapt and began inventing its own plot lines, the narrative is generally seen as losing much of its literature-like depth and complexity in favor of quickly progressing to the next shocking and spectacular moment as quickly as possible. As the show progressed independent of the novels, the visual moments started to become more and more grand and elaborate. A commonly held conception has been that television becomes more quality as it becomes more cinematic, elevating the generally low culture, bad object of television to the level of high art film. Production quality and budgets for Game of Thrones obviously increased dramatically over the progression of the series, but many regard the overall quality of the show to be much lower in the more cinematic final seasons. Variety reported that the 8th season had a budget of at least $90 million for the entire season, with around $15 million spent on each of its 6 episodes. This is comparable to the budget of another concluding chapter of a highly acclaimed fantasy series, The Lord of the Rings: The Return of the King, a film which reportedly had a budget of around $94 million. While comparable in budget and cinematic visual effects, the final season of Game of Thrones is still regarded as a finale of lesser quality than that of Return of the King. This would seem to suggest that issues of media quality surpass simply the formal aspects of cinematic spectacle. I believe the heart of this discrepancy lies in the nature of the aspect of complex narrative storytelling that has been referred to as the narrative special effect.
Sir Ilan, bring me his head.
At the end of Game of Thrones' first season, the honorable and heroic Ned Stark was killed as a result of his mistakes, setting the tone that no one, not even the main protagonist in this series, was supposed to be safe from brutal consequences. In the show's third season, the antagonistic Jaime Lannister loses his right hand as a result of his arrogance and misjudgment.
This should help you remember.
This moment reinforced how heroes, villains, and everyone in between were subject to the same cruel rules of this fictional world. And in perhaps the show's most famous example of the narrative special effect, the next traditionally heroic protagonist, Robb Stark, is murdered alongside his entire campaign at the end of the third season as a consequence of following typically noble qualities in a world that's been shown not to reward such virtuous people.
Mother, the Lannisters send their regards.
While upsetting and shocking for audiences, these events forced viewers to reevaluate what to expect from the series, and encourage them to revisit past moments in the show to see how these surprising story moments logically developed. The original excitement for fans lay not in how visually appealing and cinematic the show was, but in how Game of Thrones broke normal television conventions, such as the protagonist being kept unrealistically safe for the sake of the plot, and impressed viewers on how exactly the writers were able to convincingly pull off such complex and realistic narrative consequences.
I did warn you not to trust me.
Later on in the series, these narrative special effects became less utilized in favor of more conventional cinematic spectacles, with the cinema of attraction meant to amaze viewers visually rather than narratively. In Season 6, Sansa illogically doesn't tell Jon key information about the reinforcements for their upcoming battle, in order to preserve the climax of a surprise rescue moment that turns the tide of the battle in our hero's favor. In Season 8, Daenerys, who has previously been nothing but benevolent and kind to the innocent, suddenly becomes a tyrant who massacres an entire civilian population with little to no preceding character build-up. The later seasons no longer invested time in showing how they got to these monumental story moments, and simply showed the spectacle without regard for remaining diegetically consistent, narratively engaging, and emotionally honest to the characters and relationships, and without rewarding viewers for closely following the narrative, characters, and story world from the beginning. In general, the earlier seasons demonstrated how audience-favorite characters who were outmatched or made mistakes in dangerous situations paid the honest and harsh price for their blunders.
Say it!
Yet in later seasons, characters survive impossible odds so that they can continue on to the next spectacular plot point, regardless of the low likelihood of their survival. These conventionally cinematic moments are meant to keep viewers engaged and concerned for the livelihoods of their favorite characters, but actually work to progressively drain tension as the show continually abandons the complexity and realism that defined the first half of the series. This compressing of narrative complexity in favor of spectacle could in part be a result of the later seasons having fewer episodes. Starting with the 7th season, Game of Thrones reduced its episode count from 10 episodes per season to 7, and down once again to only 6 episodes in its 8th and final season. Typically, shorter seasons are normal in premium cable environments, where the story doesn't have to be stretched beyond its limits to conform to the typical broadcast model of 22 episodes. And also so more of the budget can be allocated to increase production quality and hire more prestigious crew meant to bring distinction to the series. However, the drawback to this, as seen in Game of Thrones, is that the decreasing season lengths meant that there was significantly less time amidst the grand, time-consuming spectacles for the detailed storytelling and emotional character moments that defined the slower pace of the earlier seasons, and which are also hallmarks of the complex serialized series attributed in the new golden age of artistically legitimized television. After the airing of the show's final season, showrunner Dan Weiss reportedly said at a convention that he wanted to expand the fan base beyond the fantasy fan base to mothers and NFL players. This clearly reflects an attitude more akin to the classic broadcast network mandate of making less offensive and less complex programming that is accessible to as large and diverse an audience as possible, rather than the usual focus of premium cable channels like HBO on pleasing smaller, niche audiences with creative content that would keep them heavily invested in the series.
And they would never cancel Game of Thrones. It's a crossover hit. It's not just for fantasy enthusiasts. They're telling human stories in a fantasy world.
Game of Thrones found widespread acclaim and popularity for initially following HBO's mandate of providing content that couldn't be found anywhere else on broadcast television. A rich story centered on multi-dimensional characters that faced relatable problems and realistic consequences in a unique fantasy setting. The fan following of the show continued to grow to exceptional sizes as it continued to tell the immersive story of George Martin's books. However, once the showrunners were left only with brief story outlines of the source material for guidance on how to conclude the story, Game of Thrones made the perhaps fatal choice halfway through the series' production to shift focus not on how its story was told, but rather on simply what was being shown. With this priority shift, the latter half of the show demonstrated how the more conventional amazement of cinematic spectacles made for the masses aren't necessarily enough to distinguish a show above common media offerings. It was rather that the monumental, shocking moments of the series were backed up by a realistic, consistent, and emotionally complex narrative that made the first 4 seasons of Game of Thrones quality television.